My husband and I went to Quebec over the summer to visit his parents, and while we were there, for those of you who don't know Quebec, it's in French Canada, and as such, it is very, very French. It reminds me of actual France in Europe. And the pastry shops and bakeries are super on point over there. We had so much good pastry, so much good bread. One place in particular, they sold this cake. Well, it's not quite right to call it a cake. It's a French patisserie sort of thing. If you're a fan of the Great British Bake Off, it's something that the Final Four would make as their showstopper. It's basically like 4 different types of dessert all in one, kind of in the shape of a cake. And this one that we saw in this particular patisserie, it was so awesome. Not only did my husband insist we get a slice of it to eat there, he insisted we just buy a whole cake and take it with us back to his parents' house and slowly eat it the next few days. And I caved in and I bought it. It was about 25 Canadian dollars, and it was worth it. And so my husband challenged me to recreate, to reverse engineer that cake that we had almost half a year ago. Actually, half a year ago by now. It's early December as I make this video. He challenged me to reverse engineer that and make that cake at home. So we had some friends over for a special Friendsgiving dinner recently. I made prime rib and mashed potatoes, which is mashed parsnips and potatoes, and other things. And I decided to make this special French dessert to go with it. So let's see how I did. So as I said, this dessert has many elements. The bottom part is what is called a clafoutis, which is sort of like a pancake that's really thick that you bake in the oven, or it's like a really thick crepe almost. The batter is kind of like crepe batter or pancake batter, and then you pour it into a cake pan and you put little bits of fruit, either cherries traditionally or blueberries or raspberries. In this case, it was raspberries. So I did that, baked that in a 6-inch cake pan. And then I made the ring of passion fruit mango jello that was also in the center of the cake. So I've not made jello many times in my life, and I was really nervous that this wasn't going to set up well enough, so I added too much gelatin in hindsight, but it set up. I made mango puree out of fresh mangoes that I bought at the store, which were grossly out of season and therefore grossly expensive. They didn't have passion fruit. I checked like 4 different stores, so I had to use passion fruit syrup, but Tarani makes really good passion fruit syrup. It actually tastes like passion fruit, so instead of sugar, I just used passion fruit syrup. I had my mango passion fruit jello center ring, also in the 6-inch cake mold. And then there was also a sponge cake layer. So you got the clafoutis, and then you have jello, and then you have sponge cake. And for that, I made basically my tiramisu French sponge cake. If you look at my tiramisu cake video, I show you how to actually make that cake. Made that one, the reduced recipe, and I did it in a 9-inch cake pan instead of a 6-inch cake, because I wanted a really thin piece and I didn't want to have to slice it and risk messing that up. So I made the bigger cake and punched out the size I needed later. Then on top of the sponge, there's a layer of raspberry jam. And I actually made some raspberry jam last summer, a few months ago. From raspberries, and I'd been keeping it in the freezer, and I took that out and I spread the raspberry jam on. And then connecting all of these layers, so between some of the layers and also around all of the layers. If you watch Cooking Tree, that channel, it's an ASMR cooking channel, that chef there makes a lot of desserts like this that have like gelatinized mousse holding a bunch of different layers of stuff together. It's like that. But anyway, it was an almond mousse in the original piece, but I hate almond extract, so I did hazelnut mousse instead. Hazelnuts are better than almonds anyway, so I did hazelnut mousse, and so hazelnut mousse between some of the layers and all around the whole thing. And then that was terrifying because, if that doesn't set up, the whole dessert just kind of falls apart and splidges everywhere. But if you add too much gelatin to that mousse, it's just kind of gross. I mean, the gelatin area of mango passion fruit jello that I added too much gelatin to is also slightly on the gross side, but it's even worse if you do that with the mousse, which is a blancmange mousse, because it has custard and it also has gelatin in it. Made a hazelnut custard first, then mixed it in with whipped cream, added a bunch of hazelnut extract and gelatin, and voila, your hazelnut mousse. And then, that wasn't enough already. Actually, I've made all of these elements before, like separately. I've made a mousse before, I've made jello before, I've made clafoutis before, and I've made sponge cake before. So all of that, and jelly, I've made that before too, jam. So I've made all those elements before. But the last element, the mirror glaze, I've never made a glaze before like that. And this is not a mirror glaze with chocolate. Those are actually easier, I think, in theory. I've made chocolate glazes before. But this is a gelatinized glaze. It has gelatin in it. With fruit. It's a fruit-based glaze. There's no chocolate, no milk in it. Mango passion fruit glaze, again. So I took the same coulis that I made for the jello disc, and I just made that glaze. I used sort of like Franken recipes for this entire cake, so the ratios were not that reliable. And unfortunately, the glaze was a little bit where I messed up. I poured it on when the glaze was just a little too warm, so it didn't quite adhere right the way it was supposed to. And then in the original dessert, they had little wedges, little square-shaped shavings, I guess, for lack of a better word. They're thin, of white chocolate. My husband and I don't like white chocolate, so I did dark chocolate, and I didn't have like a square shaped template, so I actually just used a heart shaped cookie cutter and made my own heart templates and put that on there. I would have done chocolate leaves because it's actually a lot easier and looks more impressive, but it's like the dead of winter. There's no leaves on the trees anymore, so I couldn't. And it actually turned out in appearance so much better than I thought it would. Like if I'd just bothered to clean that spilt Jello glaze off the edges of the plate, I think it would actually look pretty finished and professional. I was just kind of frazzled and in a hurry, and we had friends over, and I'd been cooking all day, and I was just like, I don't care anymore at that point. At the most important part, when you're supposed to make it all look pretty. But anyway, I think I did a pretty decent job. And here it is the day after. It's like already starting to kind of sink, and the mousse is already starting to melt a little bit because it's been out for like 15 minutes while I was setting up the camera and like talking for the first 10 minutes. But yeah, it worked out pretty well, if I do say so myself. I think the clafoutis layer, it's so good. It tastes better today, actually, than it did last night. Partly because I'm not like stuffed after eating a bunch of prime rib. I actually have an appetite right now. Also, I think it softened up the, because the clafoutis layer, the bottom layer before was a little too thick, but now the mousse has softened it a bit, and it's better. And this gelatin layer, it's just too hard. If I were to make this again, which I probably won't because that would be crazy, I would definitely put less gelatin in that. And the glaze, yeah, I think it would have worked if I just left it on a little longer. And then see this outer rim of the mousse right there? I think that's a little too thick. So if I were to make this again, I would probably get like a 7-inch diameter mold for the inner layers instead of a 6-inch mold. I think that ratio would have been a bit better. And then I would have had more mousse for, see, I don't know if you can see it very well, but like the top of the cake, there's barely any mousse. And there should be like an inch or two of mousse on the top of the cake under the glaze. You can see the little raspberry and the little sponge cake. Sponge cake worked out well. Like that was the least worrisome part about this whole thing. It was the easiest part, easily. But yeah, most importantly, it tastes really good. Of course, it doesn't taste as good as the one that we got in Quebec. And that's made by professional French pastry chefs. But yeah, I don't think this would have got me eliminated from the semifinals of the Great British Bake Off. What do you guys think? Anyway, thank you for indulging me on this little food adventure. This is one of those things where I do not encourage lay people to, you know, attempt to make their own super fancy desserts to save money, because honestly, like the mangoes and raspberries alone in this thing were super expensive, mostly because they were out of season. And if I'd been using real passion fruit instead of the syrup, that would have been really expensive too. Hazelnut extract's really expensive, the cream's really expensive. Like, I didn't run the actual numbers on this cake because I was already like busy enough as it was, like just making the cake. It took me like 8 hours to make this whole thing. I mean, that wasn't 8 hours of active cooking, but it was like, it took me a long time to make this. So I didn't feel like running like detailed numbers on the price, but I don't think it was that much cheaper for me to make this at home than it was to buy it. It was twice as much cake. So I mean, I guess by that, it was a lot cheaper, but even so, like I spent hours and hours making this thing. It wasn't as good as what I'd get at the pastry shop. And you have to be like intermediate level baker to attempt something like this. So I do not recommend that you guys try this at home unless you really like a challenge and you're an intermediate level baker. I don't really know what else to say because I'm distracted by how tasty this dessert is. So I'll just say bye now.